So the three key challenges that we're seeing facing our clients in relation to compliance with GDPR is ultimately, number one is knowing their data protection landscape. So understanding what data they hold, why they hold it, where it is actually held, and ultimately for how long they need to hold that information. So that is probably the one key challenge that they face. The second is extraterritorial effect. We have a lot of non-EEA clients that are looking at GDPR and they're concerned as to its application to them, and given that GDPR has an extraterritorial effect, it will apply to those entities. So from that perspective, that is a key challenge for them to understand the fundamental principles laid down by data protection, because they're organisations that weren't traditionally caught by this piece of legislation. And lastly, the final challenge for a lot of entities is ultimately the appointment of a data protection officer and trying to find someone who has the specific credentials required to enforce compliance within an organisation. What we're seeing in practice in relation to Brexit and GDPR is ultimately a lot of our clients are looking at Brexit as an opportunity to reassess their service providers. So those service providers that are traditionally based in the UK, they are looking at alternatives to ensure from our clients' perspective that they address GDPR compliance, and that once Brexit takes effect, that they won't actually be affected in that regard. So yes, it is having an impact from a practical perspective. In relation to GDPR readiness in Irish firms, I would say if you asked me the question a couple of weeks ago, I'd probably say it was not so much on their radar. But in the last, let's say, a couple of weeks, we've seen a huge increase, I'd say more than 80% increase in clients approaching us in relation to GDPR compliance queries. I think generally Irish firms are possibly behind the curve when it comes to GDPR compliance. I expect there was a little bit of GDPR fatigue out there when it comes to compliance, but it would appear that they're starting to refocus their minds in relation to compliance, and while they may not be fully compliant by the 25th of May, they'll have hopefully begun the process. So for those late adopters in relation to the GDPR compliance work stream, we'd recommend that firstly they understand their data protection landscape. So understand what data they have, where they have it, why they have it, and also how long they should be retaining that information. So that's a first fundamental step required. Secondly, make sure that their contracts are right. Ensure that each agreement that they have in place with a data processor or another data controller from a sharing perspective is up to date and compliant with GDPR requirements in that regard. And then lastly, transparency. Transparency is key when it comes to GDPR compliance. So ensure that your data privacy notices with your customers are GDPR compliant and provide the transparent information required.